Scientists installed cameras in an abandoned forest. What they discovered was shocking. Dr. Sarah Chin stood at the edge of Blackwood Forest, watching the morning mist curl between the ancient trees like ghostly fingers. The dense canopy above blocked most of the sunrise, creating an eternal twilight beneath the branches. Perfect conditions for their wildlife study, she thought, though the perpetual dimness made her skin crawl. "Hey, boss! Got another camera ready for setup?" Mike Reynolds, one of her graduate students, called out from the back of their research van. His enthusiasm was infectious, even at 6 a.m. Sarah smiled, remembering her own excitement during her first major field study. "Just remember the protocol," she replied, walking back to help him. "Cameras need to be at least 50 meters apart, and make sure the motion sensors are calibrated for medium to large wildlife." "I know," Mike finished, grinning. "This isn't my first rodeo anymore, Dr. Chin." Sarah nodded, though she couldn't shake her protective instinct over both her students and the equipment. The university had nearly rejected their grant proposal, citing the forest's controversial history. It had taken months of arguing and revised proposals before they'd finally approved the funding for their 3-month study of nocturnal predator behavior patterns. As they worked, Dr. James Morrison, their team's technology expert, emerged from the mobile command center they'd set up at the forest's edge. His silver-streaked hair was disheveled, and dark circles hung under his eyes. He'd spent most of the night configuring their surveillance system. "Network's finally cooperating," he announced, sipping from a massive coffee mug. "We should be able to monitor all feeds remotely now. Though I still think 15 cameras is overkill for Phase 1. Better too much data than too little," Sarah replied. She didn't mention her other reason for the extensive coverage: the disappearances. 3 hiking groups had vanished in Blackwood Forest over the past decade. The cases remained unsolved, though local law enforcement blamed it on people getting lost in the vast woodland. Sarah hoped their cameras might provide answers, even if that wasn't their primary research goal. The 4th member of their core team, Dr. Daniel Weber, emerged from the forest, wiping sweat from his brow. The behavioral specialist had been marking optimal camera locations since dawn. "We've got some interesting game trails about half a mile in," he reported. "Lots of fresh tracks, deer, coyote, and something bigger. Bear, maybe?" Sarah felt a flutter of excitement. Large predators were exactly what they were hoping to document. "Perfect. Mike, help Daniel with the next batch of cameras. James and I will finish the network setup." As the others headed into the woods, James cleared his throat. "You know, the locals think we're crazy for being here." He kept his voice low, though the others were already out of earshot. "My motel owner practically begged me to stay somewhere else when I mentioned Blackwood." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Small towns and their superstitions. You know how it goes. One person gets lost, rumors start, and suddenly every shadow holds a monster." "It's not just that," James persisted. "I did some digging last night. This place has a history going back centuries. The Native American tribes avoided it completely. Settlers wrote about strange lights, missing livestock. In the 1950s, an entire research station was abandoned overnight. Equipment left behind, personal belongings still in place, but everyone just gone. If you're trying to scare me, it won't work," Sarah said firmly, though something in his words made her stomach tighten. "We're scientists, James. Whatever happened here has a rational explanation, and if we happen to find it while conducting our study, all the better." They worked through the morning, setting up the remaining cameras and confirming each feed. By early afternoon, their monitoring system was fully operational. The command center's main wall displayed all 15 camera feeds, each showing a different section of the forest. Motion sensors would trigger recording automatically, while also alerting them via their tablets and phones. "Looks like we're ahead of schedule," Sarah announced, checking her tablet one last time. "Let's do a final sweep of the locations before dark then." A sharp beeping interrupted her. Camera 7 had detected movement. "Probably just wind," Mike suggested, but they all gathered around the monitor anyway. The footage showed a small clearing, empty except for scattered leaves dancing in the breeze. Then something moved at the edge of the frame, too quick to identify, but definitely larger than a deer. "Rewind it," Sarah ordered, leaning closer. James complied, playing the footage frame by frame. The image quality was excellent, even in the forest's dim light. But when they reached the movement, confusion spread across their faces. For a single frame, something stood at the tree line, a dark figure, humanoid in shape but wrong somehow. Its proportions seemed stretched, its posture rigid and unnatural. "That has to be a glitch," Daniel said, but his voice wavered slightly. "Or someone hiking through." Sarah frowned, studying the frozen image. "In the middle of nowhere, on the first day we set up cameras? That's one hell of a coincidence." She straightened up, decision made. "Daniel, take Mike and check it out. Stay in radio contact. James and I will monitor from here." As they watched their colleagues trek through the forest on other camera feeds, Sarah couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The figure had seemed to be looking directly at camera 7, as if it knew exactly where it was. As if it had been waiting for them to start watching. "There's something else," James said quietly, enhancing the image further. "Look at where it's standing." Sarah looked closer, and felt her blood run cold. The figure cast no shadow, despite the angle of the sun clearly showing shadows from the trees around it. "Don't tell the others yet," she decided after a long moment. "Let's see what they find first. Maybe there's a simple explanation." But as she watched Daniel and Mike approach the clearing on camera 7's feed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something far more complex than their wildlife study. The forest seemed darker somehow, the shadows deeper, and every rustle of leaves made her jump. They were being watched. She was certain of it now. And somehow, she knew this was only the beginning. The mobile command center hummed with electronic equipment as Sarah reviewed the footage for the 100th time. 3 days had passed since they'd first spotted the figure, and what they'd discovered since then defied all logical explanation. She rubbed her tired eyes, the multiple monitors casting a blue glow across her face in the dimly lit room. "You need to see this," James called out, his voice tight with tension. He'd been analyzing the nighttime feeds, comparing data from different cameras. "I've found something disturbing." Sarah moved to his workstation, where he had several video feeds playing simultaneously. "What am I looking at?" "Watch camera 7, he said, pointing to the central monitor. "Now look at the timestamp." The footage showed their now familiar visitor, the unnaturally still figure at the forest's edge. But as Sarah watched the timestamp, her blood ran cold. It wasn't moving forward consistently. Sometimes it jumped ahead several minutes, other times it seemed to repeat the same second over and over. "That's impossible," she whispered, leaning closer. "The equipment's been checked multiple times." "It gets worse," James replied, pulling up another feed. "This is from camera 4, same night. Different angle, different timestamp anomalies. But look at the figure itself." Sarah studied the image. The figure stood exactly as it had in every other recording, impossibly still, its proportions slightly wrong in ways that made her uncomfortable to look at. But something was different. "It's not casting a shadow," she realized, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "Even with the infrared imaging, we should see some kind of thermal signature on the ground around it. But there's nothing." Mike burst into the command center, out of breath. The young graduate student had been checking the physical cameras, making sure none had been tampered with. His usually cheerful face was pale. "Dr. Chen," he gasped, "you need to come see camera 12. Now." They followed him into the forest, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees. Sarah noticed Mike's hands were shaking as he held the GPS navigator. When they reached camera 12, she immediately saw why. The camera itself was untouched, but the ground beneath it was different. In a perfect circle around the camera's post, the grass had withered and died. Not gradually, as would happen naturally, but in a precise geometric pattern. "It happened overnight," Mike explained, his voice barely above a whisper. I checked this camera yesterday evening. The grass was fine. Sarah knelt to examine the dead vegetation. The blades hadn't been cut or burned. They looked like they'd been dead for months, dried and gray. Yet just outside the circle, the grass remained lush and green. Take samples, she ordered, her scientific training kicking in despite her unease. Soil, grass, everything. And I want temperature readings of the entire area. Back at the command center that evening, Daniel arrived with the preliminary test results. The behavioral specialist looked troubled as he spread the papers across their meeting table. The grass samples are wrong, he began, pointing to several microscope photographs. The cellular structure has been altered in ways I can't explain. It's like they aged decades in a single night. And the soil samples. He paused, shaking his head. The bacteria count is 0. Completely sterile. That's not possible, Sarah protested. Even in the most extreme conditions, you'd find some microscopic life. Well, something made everything in that circle simply stop, Daniel replied. Stop growing, stop living, stop existing as it should. A beeping from the monitors interrupted them. Camera 7 was active again. They rushed to the screens, watching as the familiar figure appeared at its usual spot. But tonight was different. It moved, Mike whispered. The figure hadn't walked or shifted. Instead, it seemed to flicker, like a glitch in the video. One moment it was at its usual position, the next it was several feet closer to the camera. They watched in horrified fascination as it continued this impossible movement, each flicker bringing it nearer. Check the other cameras, Sarah ordered, her mouth dry. James quickly brought up all feeds. What they saw made them collectively step back from the monitors. Every camera showed a figure now, each one exhibiting the same unnatural stillness, the same wrong proportions. And they were all facing inward, toward the center of their research area. Count them, Daniel said quietly. Sarah did. Her hands began to shake. 15 figures. 1 for each camera. Look at their positions, Mike added, pulling up their map of the camera locations. He quickly marked each figure's location. They're forming a pattern. Connected on the map, the figures' positions created a complex geometric shape, one that seemed to hurt their eyes if they looked at it too long. It reminded Sarah of the dead grass circle, but vastly larger and more intricate. We need to shut this down, James said firmly. Pack up and leave. This isn't wildlife research anymore, it's something else entirely. But Sarah couldn't look away from the monitors. Because she noticed something else, something the others hadn't seen yet. In each feed, the figures' heads were tilted at slightly different angles. When she mentally connected these angles, they pointed to a specific spot in the forest, an area they hadn't explored yet. No, she said quietly. We can't leave. Don't you see? This isn't random. They're trying to show us something. Or lead us into a trap, Daniel suggested. Sarah stood up, decision made. Science is about facing the unknown. About finding answers, even when those answers might frighten us. Tomorrow night, I'm going to that spot in the forest. Whatever these things are, whatever they want, it's time we found out. The monitors continued to flicker with their impossible images, and in the growing darkness outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Whether in anticipation or dread, none of them could say. But as Sarah prepared for the next night's expedition, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd already passed some point of no return. The figures had been watching them, yes, but perhaps, all along, they'd been waiting for someone to watch back. Movement detected on camera 3. Mike's voice cut through the tense silence of the command center. It was just past midnight, and the team had been watching the feeds with increasing anxiety. Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the monitor. The figure was there, but something was different. Instead of its usual position at the forest's edge, it stood halfway between its normal spot and the camera. The footage showed no movement. One frame it was at its original location, the next it had shifted closer. Play it frame by frame, Sarah ordered, her throat tight. James complied, his fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard. This doesn't make sense, Daniel muttered, watching the timestamps. Look, there's no missing time between frames. It's like it only exists when we're not watching it move. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She'd been studying the footage for days now, trying to understand the pattern. The figures appeared every night, always in the same spots, always perfectly still. But now, check the other cameras, she commanded. The wall of monitors flickered to life, showing feeds from all 15 cameras. What they saw made them collectively step back. Every figure had moved closer to its respective camera. Not by the same distance, some had barely shifted, while others were unnervingly close to the lenses. They're hurting us, James whispered. Look at the pattern they're creating. They're forcing us toward the center of the research area. Sarah pulled up their map on the main computer. When she plotted the figures' new positions, she saw he was right. Their locations formed a shrinking spiral, all pointing toward a central location they hadn't yet explored. Dr. Chin, Mike called out, his voice shaking. Camera 7 just look. The figure in Camera 7's feed was different from the others. While they all maintained their unnaturally rigid posture, this one had turned its head to face the camera directly. The motion blur that usually obscured its features had cleared slightly, revealing what looked like a face, but wrong somehow, like a child's attempt to draw human features without ever having seen them. Thermal imaging is picking up something new, Daniel reported, switching to infrared view. The figure showed up as a void in the thermal map, not just cold, but completely absent of any temperature reading. More disturbing were the waves of distortion spreading out from it in perfect geometric patterns. The dead grass circles are expanding, Mike added, checking the ground-level sensors they'd installed. Every time they move, the circles grow. At this rate, they'll reach our command center by tomorrow night. Sarah made a decision. We need to see what's at the center of their pattern. Now before. A high-pitched whine cut through the room. Every piece of electronic equipment squealed simultaneously, screens flickering with interference. When the noise subsided, the timestamp on every camera read 3:33 a.m., though their wall clock still showed 12:47. That's impossible, James breathed, checking his watch. We didn't just lose 3 hours. Look at the shadows in the footage, Daniel pointed out. They matched the 3:33 timestamp, not midnight. Somehow time actually jumped. Sarah felt reality shifting around her, like waking from a dream only to find yourself in another dream. She grabbed her research tablet and began typing frantically. The temporal displacement we found in the grass samples, she said as she worked. It's not just affecting plants anymore. It's spreading. These beings, whatever they are, they're not just moving through space. They're moving through time. As if in response to her revelation, the figure in Camera 7 tilted its head at an impossible angle. The motion was sudden, jerky, like a glitch in a video game. Its blurred features seemed to ripple, and for a split second, Sarah could have sworn she saw her own face looking back at her. We need to go out there, she announced, already reaching for her gear. That's stupid, James protested. We have no idea what these things are capable of. Exactly, Sarah replied, checking her equipment. We're scientists. When we don't understand something, we investigate. Whatever these beings are, they're trying to communicate. The patterns, the temporal anomalies, the dead grass, it's all deliberate. They want us to find something. Let me come with you, Daniel offered, but Sarah shook her head. I need you all here, monitoring everything. If something happens... She paused, then continued more quietly. If something happens, burn all the footage and get out of the forest. Don't try to find me. The command center felt too small suddenly, too fragile against the vast darkness outside. Through the windows, Sarah could see the forest had changed. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive, moving in ways that shadows shouldn't. She checked her protective gear one last time: environmental suit, oxygen mask, radiation detector, and multiple cameras to document whatever she might find. The chest-mounted camera was specially designed for low-light conditions, with backup power sources and redundant recording systems. Sarah, James called out as she reached the door. The figures, they're all moving again. She looked back at the wall of monitors. Every figure had taken another step closer to their respective cameras. But now they were all facing the same direction, toward the spot where she planned to go. Keep recording everything, she instructed. No matter what you see or hear, don't stop recording. As Sarah stepped out into the forest, her headlamp cutting a weak path through the darkness, she felt the weight of scientific certainty falling away. Whatever waited at the center of the figure's pattern, she knew it would challenge everything she understood about reality. Behind her, in the command center, the monitors continued their silent vigil. And in Camera 7's feed, the figure with her face watched her go, its blurred features twisting into what might have been a smile. The forest seemed to pulse around Sarah as she made her way toward the center of the figure's pattern. Her headlamp's beam appeared to bend slightly, light behaving in ways it shouldn't. The environmental suit's sensors beeped steadily, recording data she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. Status check. James's voice crackled through her radio, distorted but audible. I'm okay, she responded, checking her GPS. About half a kilometer from the calculated center point. Temperature continuing to drop, suit readings show -15 Celsius. The figures are. James's voice cut out for a moment. They're moving again. All of them. But not like before. Sarah forced herself to keep walking as she waited for him to continue. The darkness between the trees felt alive, watching. They're not just getting closer to the cameras, James explained, static threatening to overwhelm his words. They're following you. Matching your movements, but always staying just out of your light's range. She wanted to turn around, to verify his words, but something told her that would be a mistake. Instead, she checked her tablet's feed from the camera mounted on her back. The image quality was poor, disrupted by the same interference affecting all their equipment, but she could make out shapes in the darkness, tall, and possibly still figures arranged in a perfect circle around her position. Dr. Chen. Mike's voice joined the radio communication. We found something in the historical satellite data. You need to see this. I'm a little busy right now, Sarah replied, ducking under a low-hanging branch. The dead grass pattern had spread here, creating geometric shapes that hurt her eyes if she looked at them too long. The patterns the figures are making, they're not new, Mike continued urgently. I found similar geometric formations in satellite images dating back to the 1970s. Every few years, the same configurations appear, but they're usually hidden by the tree canopy. And... He hesitated. What is it? Sarah prompted, trying to keep the growing dread from her voice. Each pattern appeared just before someone went missing in the forest. The research station in the 50s, the hiking groups, everything. But here's the thing, the patterns are evolving. Getting more complex. Like they're building up to something. Sarah processed this information as she walked. The figures weren't just moving randomly. They were recreating an established pattern, but with a new level of intricacy. Her team's arrival had triggered something, accelerated a process that had been unfolding for decades. There's more, Daniel cut in. I've been analyzing the temporal displacement readings. The dead grass isn't just aging, it's experiencing multiple timelines simultaneously. When I combine the data with the historical patterns, he took a deep breath. Sarah, I think these beings are trying to create a permanent temporal intersection point. A place where multiple realities overlap. The implications hit her like a physical blow. The missing people, she whispered. They're not dead, are they? They're scattered. Spread across different timelines. Her radio erupted in static, then went silent. The tablet's screen flickered and died. Even her headlamp dimmed, though it kept functioning. She was close to something, she could feel it in the way reality seemed to bend around her. Then she saw it. In a small clearing ahead, barely visible in her failing light, stood an old campsite. Tattered tent fabric fluttered in a wind she couldn't feel. Rusted equipment lay scattered across dead grass that formed perfect fractals. Sarah approached carefully, her scientific mind cataloging details even as her instincts screamed at her to run. The campsite looked decades old, but something was wrong with its decay. Some objects appeared fresh, while identical items next to them had completely rusted away. Time itself seemed broken here. "I've lost all contact with the command center." She spoke into her chest camera, documenting everything. "The campsite appears to be from the 1950s research station, but temporal distortion makes accurate dating impossible. I'm seeing, wait." Something reflected her headlamp's beam. She brushed away years of dead leaves, revealing a camera, not an old one from the 50s, but a modern digital camera, its casing unmarked by time. With trembling fingers, she checked its battery. Impossibly, it still had power. The camera's display flickered to life, showing its last recorded images. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The photos showed the same figures her team had been tracking, but from different angles, different times. The final image made her drop the camera in shock. It showed her, standing in this exact spot, taking the very same picture. "Oh God," she whispered, understanding flooding her mind. "We're not the first team to reach this point. We're the same team, over and over, scattered across time." As if responding to her realization, the forest around her grew unnaturally still. Her headlamp flickered once, twice, then stabilized. In its beam, she saw something that defied comprehension. The figures stood around the clearing's edge, but they were different now. Each one's blurred features had resolved into a face, faces she recognized. Researchers from the 1950s team, missing hikers, and herself. Multiple versions of herself, each with slightly different expressions, different clothes, different equipment. The camera at her feet had captured one loop of an endless cycle. Each time a research team entered the forest, they were drawn to this spot. Each time, they discovered the truth. And each time, they became part of the pattern, their timeline splitting off into another branch of an infinite tree. Her headlamp died, plunging her into darkness. In the distance, she heard voices from the command center calling her name. But they weren't coming from her radio, they echoed from multiple directions, multiple times, multiple realities. Sarah Chin stood in the dark, surrounded by versions of herself from countless other cycles, and realized with perfect clarity, she wasn't here to solve the mystery. She was here to become it. "Sarah!" James's voice crackled through multiple radios scattered around the old campsite, each one echoing from a different timeline. "If you can hear us, you need to get out of there now." But Sarah couldn't move. She stood transfixed as her headlamp flickered back to life, revealing the impossible scene around her. The figures, her other selves, the past researchers, the missing hikers, had drawn closer, their circle tightening. Each face was distinct now, yet somehow wrong, as if viewed through rippling water. "The temporal intersection is stabilizing." She heard Daniel's voice, not from her radio, but from somewhere in the darkness. "The readings are off the charts." "Which Daniel is that?" she whispered to herself. "Which timeline?" Her chest camera whirred, still faithfully recording everything. Sarah forced herself to speak clearly for the record, maintaining her scientific objectivity even as reality crumbled around her. "This appears to be a temporal nexus point," she documented. "Multiple timelines converging on a single location. The figures we've been observing are echoes. Remnants of previous cycles. Or future cycles. Linear time seems to have no meaning here." One of the figures stepped forward, a version of herself wearing different gear, looking slightly older. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it existed between frames of reality rather than within them. When it spoke, its voice overlapped with Sarah's own. "You need to complete the pattern," they said in unison. Sarah felt the words leaving her mouth without conscious thought. "We all do. We all did. We all will." "Dr. Chin!" Mike's panicked voice cut through her radio. "Something's happening at the command center. The dead grass patterns, they're spreading exponentially. And the monitors, every camera is showing the same thing." Sarah didn't need her tablet to know what they were seeing. The figures had all turned to face her now, and she could see the command center's lights reflecting in 15 pairs of eyes, each one showing a different version of this moment, this revelation, this choice. "The time loops," she realized aloud. "They're not just repeating. They're compounding. Each cycle adds another layer, another version, another. She trailed off as the implications hit her. How many times have we done this? Her question was answered by movement in the darkness. More figures emerged from between the trees, dozens, then hundreds, each one a variation of someone who had entered the forest. Some wore clothes from the 1950s, others carried modern equipment. All moved with that same unnatural stillness, that same broken reality flutter. Sarah, James's voice again, tight with fear. The temporal readings, they're approaching critical levels. Whatever's happening there, it's affecting everything. Time itself is breaking down. She looked down at her hands and saw them flickering, shifting between different versions of themselves. In one moment they were her own, in another they belonged to a researcher from decades ago, then they were older, younger, different yet the same. We need to stop it, she heard herself say, but the words came from multiple directions, multiple versions, multiple times. The older version of herself stepped closer. We can't stop it. They spoke in that unsettling unison. We can only become it. The pattern must be maintained. The cycle must continue. It's the only way to prevent the collapse. What collapse? Sarah demanded, but even as she asked, understanding flooded her mind. Memories that weren't hers yet, experiences she hadn't lived but was living. The forest wasn't just a location, it was a wound in reality. The patterns, the figures, the time loops, they were a containment system, designed by the first team to discover the truth. Every cycle added another layer of stability, another set of observers to hold reality together. The more we watch, her other self explained, the more real it becomes. Observation shapes reality. We're not just scientists studying a phenomenon. We're the phenomenon, Sarah finished, the truth settling into her bones. We're the observers and the observed, the researchers and the researched, the watchers and the watched. Her radio crackled one final time. Sarah, Daniel's voice, desperate now. The temporal distortion is reaching the command center. We're seeing ourselves, but different versions. What should we do? She knew what would happen next. Had seen it happen, would see it happen, was always seeing it happen. The command center would be consumed by the temporal intersection. Her team would become part of the pattern, just as she was becoming part of it now. They would spread out through the forest, standing watch through countless cycles, maintaining the delicate balance that kept reality from unraveling. Don't fight it, she said into her radio, her voice overlapping with countless other versions of herself saying the same words across time. We have to accept it. We have to become it. It's the only way. Her headlamp flickered one final time, then died completely. But Sarah could still see, not with her eyes, but with the collective awareness of every version of herself that had stood in this spot. The pattern stretched out before her, an infinite fractal of time and space, observation and reality, past and future and present all existing simultaneously. She felt her body begin to change, to shift, to become something that could exist in multiple times at once. The other figures drew closer, welcoming her into their eternal vigil. Soon, she would take her place among them. Soon, she would watch another Saracen enter the forest, drawn by the same mysteries that had drawn her. Soon, she would become both the watcher and the watched, the researcher and the researched, locked in an endless cycle of observation and revelation. And somewhere in the darkness, another version of herself was already beginning the cycle anew. 3 months after the Blackwood Forest incident, Dr. James Morrison sat alone in his university office, staring at a blank incident report form on his computer screen. The cursor blinked accusingly, waiting for an explanation he couldn't give, or rather, one he dared not write. The official story was simple enough: equipment malfunction, contaminated samples, and team leader Dr. Sarah Chin suffering from environmental exposure. The university had accepted this explanation, eager to avoid controversy. The equipment had been written off, the study terminated, and the forest site marked as unsuitable for future research. But the truth lived in a hard drive locked in James's desk drawer, and in the nightmares that woke him every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. His phone buzzed, a text from Mike. "It's happening again. Turn on the news. James's hands shook as he opened his laptop. The headline made his blood run cold. Research team missing in Blackwood Forest. History repeats as second scientific expedition vanishes. No, he whispered. It's too soon. The pattern wasn't supposed to repeat for years. His office phone rang, making him jump. The caller ID showed Daniel's number. James hadn't spoken to him since their escape from the forest. None of them had. They'd made a pact to stay away, to prevent the pattern from spreading. You saw the news? Daniel's voice was rough, haunted. They couldn't have known, James replied. We destroyed everything, burned all the evidence. Not everything. Daniel paused. Check your email. Someone uploaded footage to the university's cloud server last night. It's from Sarah's chest camera. James opened his email with trembling fingers. The video file was massive, corrupted in places, but playable. As it began, he felt reality shift around him, just as it had that night in the forest. The footage showed Sarah's final moments, but not as they'd witnessed them from the command center. This was different, clearer, more complete. They watched through her eyes as she faced the temporal intersection, as she understood the truth, as she became part of the pattern. But there was more. The containment is failing, Daniel said as they watched. Look at the timestamps. The video was uploaded simultaneously to servers across the world, at precisely 3:33 a.m. in every time zone. It's not just spreading, it's accelerating. James noticed something in the video's background, a detail they'd missed before. Behind the figures surrounding Sarah, deeper in the darkness, stood something else. Something vast. The camera's focus couldn't quite capture it, as if reality itself rejected its presence. That's what the pattern was containing, he realized. That's what they were trying to keep out. The footage glitched, showing multiple perspectives simultaneously. They saw Sarah transforming, becoming one of the Watchers. But they also saw beyond her, through her, into the spaces between moments where something ancient stirred. The new team, Daniel whispered. They're not just missing. They're being recruited. James understood with sudden, horrifying clarity. The pattern hadn't just been maintaining itself, it had been preparing. Growing stronger. Each cycle added more observers, more anchors to reality, because what they were holding back was growing stronger too. His computer screen flickered, showing his own face for a moment, but wrong, distorted, as if viewed through fractured time. In the reflection, he saw movement behind him. Daniel, he said quietly, what color is the grass outside your office? A pause. Dead. In a perfect circle. Yours? The same. James watched as the geometric patterns spread across his university's lawn. It's not just a forest anymore, is it? The containment is breaking down everywhere. We have to go back, Daniel said. We're part of it now. We always were. James turned slowly in his chair. A figure stood in his office corner, tall, still, wearing Sarah's face but not quite right. Its eyes held the knowledge of countless cycles, countless versions, countless attempts to hold back the darkness between realities. The pattern must be maintained, it said in Sarah's voice, overlaid with others. The observers must observe. The watchers must watch. Will you take your place? James looked at his computer screen, at the news reports of the missing team, at the videos showing truths human minds weren't meant to comprehend. He thought of Sarah, of all the versions of her standing eternal vigil in that forest. Of all the versions of himself that had made this choice, would make this choice, were making this choice across infinite timelines. We're coming, he said, both to Daniel on the phone and to the figure in his office. We'll help maintain the pattern. The figure nodded, its movement leaving trails across time like multiple photographs overlaid. As James watched, other figures emerged from the shadows of his office, versions of himself, of Daniel, of Mike, of every researcher who had ever approached the truth. All holding reality together through their endless observation. He reached for his keys, then stopped. There's one thing I have to do first. James opened the incident report form one last time. His fingers moved across the keyboard, typing out the truth, not for the university, but for the next cycle. For those who would follow, who would discover, who would join the pattern. His final words glowed on the screen. To those who find this, we are the watchers in the woods. We are the observers who hold reality together through our eternal vigilance. We are scientists who discovered too much, researchers who learned too late that some things must remain hidden. But now we have no choice. We must maintain the pattern. We must continue our work. We must observe, record, and contain what lies between moments, between realities, between thoughts. If you're reading this, you're already part of the pattern. You always were. You always will be. Look for us in the forest. Look for us in the spaces between seconds. Look for us in every shadow, every reflection, every moment of déjà vu. We're watching. We're waiting. We're you. The screen flickered one last time, then went dark. In its reflection, James saw himself standing among the other figures, his face already beginning to blur. Outside his window, the dead grass patterns spread in perfect fractals across the campus. The pattern was evolving. The containment was changing. And somewhere in Blackwood Forest, in the spaces between moments, Sarah Chin waited with all her other selves for the next observers to join their ranks. The truth had been revealed. The cycle would continue. And the watching would never end.